Hi, this is Brian Kim. I'm going to share with you case number 57 in the best way to do cataract surgery series. This is a patient who has a seemingly routine cataract, but then started to show signs of intraoperative floppy iris syndrome. And so I'm going to show you how to navigate around this IFIS situation despite the large pupil. So I'm using a cotton tip to stabilize the eye. I'm using a corneal marker to help me center and size my rhexis. First telltale sign is you can see the pupil is a little bit asymmetrical here. I'm using a cut tip to turn the eye upward here, and then I'm going to make a paracentesis site, making sure I'm flat to the iris plane so I can get a nice corneal shelf, which will allow me to have a nice self-sealing corneal incision. I do the same maneuver on the left side now. I'm injecting some intracameral lidocaine and then dispersive viscoelastic to fill the anterior chamber. I'm using the cannula to hold the eye still. I'm doing the triplanar corneal incision, make a vertical groove, place a blade in the deep part of the groove, use a cannula to turn the eye away from me, tunnel through the cornea, turn the eye towards me with the cannula and enter. That's the triplanar corneal incision. And this is my puncture style Capsulorhexis, enter sideways, and then I'm going to puncture centrally, pull the forceps down towards me, grabbing the right edge of the tear to create a flap, and then I'm going around circumferentially using the corneal marks, which will help me to center and size the rhexis. In this case, using the corneal marks is helpful because this pupil is a little bit asymmetric. So finish off the rhexis and then burp some viscoelastic, and this will be the Capsulorhexis hydrodissection technique. I'm going to place the cannula out underneath the rhexis edge contra-incisionally, point the tip down, get a nice fluid wave, decompress on the left side, and then spin the lens on the right side, pointing the tip down, hooking the lens. Irrigating the surface of the cornea, lifting the incision with the chopper, going in with irrigation off to minimize Descemet's trauma. I'm removing the surface epinuclear material now. Place the chopper out to the equator, point the phaco tip vertically subincisionally, crushing the lens, that's the double chop, placing the chopper around the right heminucleus, pulling it centrally, crushing it, that's the cross chop. Using high vacuum to pull the first quadrant up out of the bag, and using mechanical fracturing forces to crush the lens pieces into smaller pieces. So far so good. I place the chopper around the second quadrant, crushing it against the phaco tip, using mechanical fracturing forces to crush the lens pieces into smaller pieces. So this is when I start to see the iris doing really weird things. The iris starts to almost like spasm, and you can see it billow. I turn the second heminucleus in front of me, place the chopper around the lens piece, pulling it centrally towards the phaco tip, pull the third quadrant up out of the bag with high vacuum. I'm using mechanical fracturing forces to crush it. As I'm doing this, I see a sudden change in the pupil edge here, but I go ahead very gingerly, place the chopper around the lens piece, pulling it centrally towards the phaco tip. When that pupil started to change, it tells me some more of that viscoelastic came out of the anterior chamber, and so there's much more iris instability now. So very carefully, I took that fourth quadrant out, and this is kind of the right time to put in the intracameral epinephrine. So here I'm adding intracameral epinephrine, and so the point is you can add intracameral epinephrine anytime throughout the case. Even though you don't put it at the beginning of the case, you're thinking, oh, this is not going to be an IFIS case, and suddenly if there's IFIS, you don't have to feel like you can't put epinephrine. You can put epinephrine in any time throughout the case. In this case, I took the lens out, the endonucleus out, and between endo and epinucleus, I decided to put the epinephrine in. You can see there's much more pupillary stability. It's not doing that spasming effect. So I'm removing the epinuclear material from the anterior to posterior side. I take the chopper out, push BSS in, take the phaco tip out, and then putting the INA. You can see that the iris came to the main incision a little bit, but it did not externalize. So very gently, carefully burp some fluid out and then went in with the INA handpiece. So I'm peeling the cortical material from the front to the back, anterior to posterior, starting subincisionally and peeling around, going around circumferentially. Again, I'm still in the cortex mode. I'm removing some of the cortical material off the posterior capsule surface now. Now I'm switching to polish mode, polishing underneath the rhexis edge very carefully. Of course, with IFIS, it is easy to grasp the iris when it's floppy, so that's another reason why polish mode is good in this situation. With polish mode, you won't grab the iris because in polish mode, the aspiration vacuum are really, really low. So I'm polishing the posterior capsule now, making sure there's no fine lens material on the surface, and I'm polishing under the rhexis edge again. Once I'm satisfied, I'm going to use a BSS cannula to pulse the subincisional capsular fornix, make sure there's no lens material that's trapped underneath there. Again, in this case, it's fairly clean. I'm going to inject some cohesive viscoelastic within the bag, and then very carefully withdraw the INA handpiece, making sure the iris doesn't come with. And I'm injecting more viscoelastic to push the iris away from the capsule as well. So I'm polishing with a sweep underneath the rhexis edge on the left side and then the right side to remove any potential lens epithelial cells. Once I'm satisfied with the polishing, I'm going to inject a single piece acrylic intraocular lens into the capsular bag, making sure the leading edge is within the bag and the trailing edge is out. I go in with irrigation off, start irrigation, and disengage the leading haptic off the optic and then the trailing haptic as well. Tilt the optic and then rotating the lens 90 degrees clockwise, going underneath the optic, removing all the viscoelastic from within the bag. Polishing underneath the rhexis edge some more. Once I'm sure that the bag is clean, I'm going to turn the tip down and I'm rotating the lens horizontally by sweeping at the optic haptic junction. And then I remove all the viscoelastic from the anterior chamber. You can see the iris is starting to vibrate a little bit there as the viscoelastic is removed. As more viscoelastic removed, you can see the pupil starts to jump and now it really became quite smaller. So in this case, viscodilation was very effective using the viscoelastic to tamponade the iris edge. But the key is not to remove too much viscoelastic. So I'm very careful when I take the INA handpiece out to decompress before I withdraw the INA handpiece. So again, in this case, it's important to keep as much viscoelastic in the eye, in this case, to protect the iris and buffer the iris from the phaco-tip. I'm hydrating my incision. So again, this is a IFIS case. I pushed epinephrine halfway through the case, which is fine. In this case, the viscoat really protected the iris from the phaco-tip in the high vacuum. And you also saw mechanical fracturing, double chop, cross chop, again, utilizing mechanical fracturing forces rather than going after pieces with high vacuum is really a much more safe and controlled way to do this case. So I hope this was helpful to you, and I thank you for your attention.